clean white sheets, attentive nurses, and life-saving medical care. Medieval hospitals in movies look like primitive but caring institutions where monks tend to the sick with gentle dedication. The reality was death traps that killed more patients than they saved through horrific conditions, disease transmission, and procedures that would horrify modern surgeons. Movies show medieval hospitals as quiet, clean spaces where monks tend to patients with gentle care, but real medieval hospitals were biological warfare zones that accelerated death rather than prevented it. The physical conditions alone could kill healthy visitors within days. Most hospitals packed patients into massive communal halls with no separation between different diseases. Plague victims lay next to surgical patients who shared beds with people suffering from dysentery, tuberculosis, and infected wounds. Cross-contamination wasn't a risk, it was guaranteed. Hospitals became breeding grounds for every disease imaginable. Ventilation was non-existent in most facilities. Windows were kept closed to prevent bad air from entering, which meant that infectious diseases spread through stagnant, contaminated air. The stench from unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and human waste created an atmosphere so toxic that visitors often fainted upon entering. Bedding was rarely changed and never properly cleaned. Multiple patients shared the same straw mattresses and blankets, which became saturated with blood, pus, vomit, and other bodily fluids. These conditions created perfect environments for parasites, bacteria, and viral infections to flourish and spread rapidly between patients. Water sources were contaminated by waste runoff from the hospitals themselves. Wells were often located downstream from latrines, and washing water was reused multiple times without any purification. Patients drinking hospital water were essentially consuming a cocktail of diseases from every previous patient treated in the facility. The floors were usually dirt or stone covered with rushes that became saturated with bodily fluids and were changed infrequently. Walking through hospitals meant stepping on months of accumulated waste, blood, and infected matter. These conditions made recovery nearly impossible, and infection almost inevitable. Hollywood occasionally shows medieval surgery as primitive but well-intentioned, but real medical procedures were essentially organized torture that killed more patients than they saved. Medieval hospitals performed operations that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. Amputation was the go-to solution for any limb injury or infection. Surgeons would literally hack off arms and legs using saws and knives with no anesthesia, except alcohol or opium if the patient was wealthy. The mortality rate from shock, blood loss, and post-operative infection approached 90%. Most patients died screaming during the procedure itself. Bloodletting was performed on a massive scale, often removing several pints of blood from already weakened patients. Hospital staff believed that draining blood would balance the body's humours and cure everything from headaches to plague. Weakened patients were literally bled to death in the name of medical treatment. Trepanation involved drilling holes in patients' skulls to release evil spirits or treat head injuries. Surgeons used crude drill bits to bore through bone while patients were conscious and screaming. The procedure almost always resulted in brain infection, permanent disability, or immediate death from trauma. Surgical instruments were never sterilized and were often used on multiple patients in succession. Knives, saws, and needles carried infection from one patient to the next, spreading disease rather than treating it. Surgeons didn't understand germ theory and saw no need to clean their tools between procedures. Wound treatment involved packing injuries with materials like animal dung, spider webs, or moldy bread. These remedies introduced massive infections that were often worse than the original wounds. Patients who might have recovered from minor injuries died from sepsis caused by contaminated treatments applied in unsanitary conditions. Medieval hospitals didn't just fail to cure diseases, they actively spread them through practices that would horrify modern infection control specialists. These institutions functioned as disease multiplication centers rather than healing facilities. Patient isolation was completely unknown. Highly contagious diseases like plague, smallpox, and tuberculosis patients were mixed freely with surgical cases and other illnesses. Diseases that might have remained localized instead spread throughout entire hospital populations within days of a single infected admission. Medical staff moved between patients without any concept of contamination control. The same hands that treated plague victims would immediately examine surgical patients or deliver babies. Doctors and monks carried diseases on their clothing, hands, and medical instruments from one patient to another throughout their daily rounds. Laundry practices guaranteed disease transmission. Blood-soaked bandages and clothing were washed in communal tubs using the same water for multiple patients. Clean laundry was contaminated by dirty items, and wet clothing was often put back on patients before drying, creating perfect conditions for bacterial and fungal infections. Food preparation and distribution spread gastrointestinal diseases rapidly through hospital populations. The same utensils and plates were used for multiple patients without cleaning, and food was prepared by staff who handled infected patients throughout the day. Dysentery and food poisoning were common complications that killed weakened patients. Waste disposal practices created ongoing contamination cycles. Human waste was often dumped in areas near food preparation or water sources. Latrines were located uphill from wells, and waste disposal areas attracted rats and other disease vectors that spread infections throughout hospital facilities and surrounding communities. Popular culture suggests that medieval hospitals, while primitive, at least tried to save lives, but statistical evidence from surviving records reveals mortality rates that make medieval hospitals deadlier than battlefields during major wars. Overall mortality rates in medieval hospitals ranged from 50 to 80% depending on the facility and time period. Most patients who entered hospitals never left alive, and many died within their first few days from conditions they contracted after admission rather than from their original illnesses or injuries. Surgical mortality approached 90% for major procedures like amputations or internal surgeries. The combination of shock, blood loss, infection, and post-operative complications meant that surgery was essentially a death sentence. Patients who survived the initial procedure usually died within weeks from infected wounds or systemic complications. Childbirth in hospital settings had mortality rates exceeding 25% for mothers and over 50% for infants. Hospital births were far deadlier than home births because of cross-contamination, unsanitary instruments, and inexperienced attendants. Women who gave birth in hospitals were more likely to die from childbed fever than those who delivered at home. Plague patients had mortality rates approaching 100% in hospital settings. The combination of the disease itself plus hospital-acquired infections, malnutrition, and inappropriate treatments made survival virtually impossible. Hospitals became plague death centers rather than treatment facilities during epidemic periods. Recovery rates varied dramatically by social class. Wealthy patients who could afford private rooms, better food, and personal attendants had significantly higher survival rates than poor patients warehoused in communal wards. This suggests that hospital conditions rather than medical knowledge were the primary factors determining patient outcomes. Movies portray medieval hospitals as community healthcare centers where people went for treatment, but the reality is that hospitals were places of absolute desperation, where only the most desperate and destitute ended up when all other options were exhausted. The wealthy avoided hospitals entirely, receiving medical care in their homes from private physicians and family members. Hospital patients were primarily indigents, travelers, and social outcasts who had no other options for shelter or care. Going to a hospital was essentially an admission that you had been abandoned by family and community. Many hospital patients weren't even seeking medical treatment. They were homeless, elderly or disabled individuals using hospitals as poorhouses or shelters. These institutions served more as social warehouses than medical facilities, housing people society had discarded rather than focusing on healing specific diseases or injuries. Religious pilgrims made up a significant portion of hospital populations, especially those who had collapsed from exhaustion, malnutrition, or disease during long journeys. These travelers often brought exotic diseases from distant regions, contributing to the hospital's role as disease mixing centers rather than healing institutions. Terminal patients were often brought to hospitals to die rather than to recover. Families would abandon dying relatives at hospital doors to avoid the expense and social stigma of death at home. Hospitals functioned as medieval hospices, where people went to die among strangers rather than receive life-saving treatment. The most tragic hospital patients were abandoned children and infants who had mortality rates approaching 80%. These institutions served as dumping grounds for unwanted babies and orphans, who usually died within weeks from malnutrition, disease, or neglect in overcrowded facilities with the inadequate staff and resources. Medieval hospitals weren't primitive healthcare facilities trying their best with limited knowledge. They were death factories that killed through ignorance, neglect, and practices that guaranteed rather than prevented disease transmission. The few patients who survived did so despite hospital treatment, not because of it. Your modern emergency room, with its sterile conditions, trained staff, and evidence-based medicine, would seem like a miracle to medieval people who understood that entering a hospital meant abandoning hope for recovery. The real horror wasn't the primitive medicine, it was the systematic creation of conditions that made healing impossible and death inevitable. Medieval hospitals weren't primitive healthcare facilities, they were death factories disguised as places of healing. The combination of horrific sanitation, disease transmission, and brutal procedures killed more patients than they saved. Modern hospitals would seem miraculous to people who understood that medical care usually meant accelerated death.